Before these two horror icons ever exchanged a single punch on screen, Freddy vs. Jason spent over a decade in development. Multiple studios, over a dozen scripts, and even a real-life weigh-in in Las Vegas. This is the wild story of how horror's most anticipated crossover almost didn't happen. By the mid to late 80s, A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th weren't just successful horror franchises, they were cultural phenomena. Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees had transcended the genre, becoming slasher royalty and household names. Their faces appeared on everything from toys and lunchboxes to Halloween costumes, and their films continued to pack theaters year after year. These weren't just horror villains, these two became pop culture giants. Fans of horror dreamed of a crossover, but what seemed like a no-brainer was an absolute legal nightmare. Freddy belonged to New Line Cinema while Jason was still owned by Paramount. The two studios circled each other back in 1987 to discuss a crossover, but neither wanted to give up control of their cash cow. And so the idea, it just died. It wasn't until the failure of Jason Takes Manhattan in 1989 that Jason's rights reverted to New Line, opening the door to a Freddy vs. Jason film. This idea, though, of horror icons battling each other was not something entirely new. Back in the 1940s, Universal Pictures had already been combining their monsters: Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, in a string of crossovers like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula. These weren't just novelty acts, they were early examples of shared universes. Long before comic book movies, the monsters were having cinematic team-ups. But all those creatures belonged to the same studio. There were no creative rights battles, no creative turf wars. Universal could mix and match their monsters at will. Freddy and Jason, on the other hand, came from different studios, with different tones, completely separate mythologies, and just overall style. Merging them wasn't just about fan service, it was a legal and creative gamble. And that's why what came next wasn't just a fun idea, it was a 10-year, multi-million-dollar production nightmare. At least 18 different screenplays were commissioned, many of them completely insane. Some of the ideas that were thrown out there were Freddy manipulating a cult of Jason worshippers, Freddy as a camp counselor at Crystal Lake who tormented Jason as a child, even a plan to shoot multiple endings like Clue so nobody would know who really wins at the end of the movie. New Line threw millions of dollars at writers, but every draft hit a wall. Everything changed when two relatively unknown writers, Damian Shannon and Mark Swift, pitched their version in 2001. Their pitch was simple but effective. Freddy is trapped in hell, weak and powerless, so he manipulates Jason into coming back to stir up fear and try and make a comeback. But then Jason does not stop. Freddy loses control of his monster and the ultimate fight begins. New Line loved this idea, and so production could finally begin. In terms of a director, New Line had their eyes set on a few different people: Peter Jackson, Guillermo del Toro, Rob Zombie, and Tom McLaughlin. New Line ended up hiring Ronnie Yu, the Hong Kong filmmaker who had just directed Bride of Chucky. Yu accepted, but only on the condition that he had creative freedom. He storyboarded every kill, helped redesign the look of both monsters, and trimmed the bloated script down into a very punchy, focused bloodbath. Robert Englund returned once again as Freddy, but to everybody's surprise, the role of Jason was taken by Ken Kersinger. Fans were pretty pissed off because they were all expecting the role to be reprised by Kane Hodder. Hodder had played Jason in 4 consecutive Friday films and is often regarded as the fan favorite of the franchise. It seemed really like a no-brainer for him to be given the role. But Ronnie Yu wanted a taller Jason, someone who was more physical and could tower over Freddy visually. So the part was given to Canadian stuntman Ken Kersinger, who previously worked on Jason Takes Manhattan as a stunt double. Fans were upset, Kane Hodder was hurt, but the studio stood by their choice, and to Kersinger's credit, he physically was the Jason that Ronnie Yu had in mind. Now the hype machine really kicked into overdrive. In July 2003, just weeks before release, the greatest marketing move was ever pulled. New Line staged a full-on boxing-style weigh-in at Bally's Casino in Las Vegas. Robert Englund appeared in costume as Freddy, Ken Kersinger lumbered on stage as Jason, and horror fans lost their minds. Michael Buffer, the famous announcer, called it like a pay-per-view title fight, and it was goofy, yes, but it worked. Freddy vs. Jason was officially an event, and I just think this marketing strategy is pure gold. On August 15th, 2003, Freddy vs. Jason finally hit theaters, and it was a hit. The movie made $36 million opening weekend and over $116 million worldwide. This made it the most successful film in either franchise. Critics were a little bit mixed. Some called it fan service, others called it fun, but the fans, well, they ultimately got what they came for. Two horror legends beating the hell out of each other across burning cabins, dreamscapes, and Camp Crystal Lake. Freddy vs. Jason was truly the last hurrah for early 2000s slasher horror before this big wave of remakes really started to take over the space. To this day, it remains one of the most ambitious and unlikely horror crossovers ever made. A monster mashup in the tradition of Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, but made for a new generation of horror fans. It may have taken 10 years and a trail of broken scripts to make this movie, but Freddy and Jason finally met, and horror fans everywhere are able to watch this long-awaited crossover finally come to life. Sure, it's packed with that unmistakable 2000s cheese, but that's just part of the charm. Over-the-top WWE style fight scenes, the campy dialogue, and just the fact that these two icons were able to come together for a movie is just so much fun. For all of its flaws, this movie gave fans something that we'd waited decades to see, and honestly, I'm just glad that it exists.